We haven't got toxic masculinity. What we've got is toxic attitudes to masculinity. And they are rife in the media and in politics.
Coming up on British thought leaders, male psychology expert Martin Seager on society's bias against men.
So we're basically saying a man is toxic these days and ignoring all the good things men are doing all around us. The vast majority of men are really good, but we're ignoring that and focusing on a tiny minority of men who do bad things.
Martin talks about the challenges facing boys in education.
If you go into schools now, boys are being exposed to all of this negativity about their identity, which, if you know anything about education, it's just disastrous to go in with a negative message to children about who they are.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders, I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Martin Seager, who is a male psychology specialist and mental health campaigner. Martin, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome, and thanks for inviting me.
So you started out as a more general psychologist, and then you moved towards the male field. I mean, what was it that kind of spurred you in that direction?
Trained initially as a clinical psychologist in the 1980s, really, and then worked for, I would say, about 20 years just helping whoever came through the door of the NHS. And I was sort of rose through the ranks, as you like, in the NHS, became a manager and a sort of lecturer. But it wasn't till the early 2000s that I had a trainee once who was at UEL, University of East London, and he said to me, I'm the only man, and we've got 30 psychology trainees, and I'm the only man, help. And he'd read a few things by Warren Farrell, and I was in my 40s, and I was the head of psychology in a London mental health trust, and I hadn't thought of men as having a gender issue. So if I, in my 40s, a psychologist, hadn't thought of men having a gender issue, what hope is there, for society? That's why society is so blind still to male gender issues. But that was the turning point for me, because I wanted to then include men in my thinking. And then I looked into the science and the evidence. There just was hardly anything there. For in psychology, there was almost no, only about 20% of trainees were men. There was no teaching about men's issues in psychology training. And so it just became like a massive open door for me. I couldn't believe other people were not thinking about it somewhere. And I hooked up with my colleague John Barry. And then we started trying to work on developing the male psychology section of the British Psychological Society. So that is actually an opportunity to formalise male psychology within the British Psychological Society. That took us over 10 years to do, and we had a third of people voting against it. So these things, so again, we were developing theories around bias towards men, but our own experiences were validating that bias theory because we were struggling to even get male psychology recognised. So I think in psychology, if there was if male gender was invisible within psychology, I had the feeling of what hope is there really for the rest of society and the media. So it's been my quest, along with many other good people, and some of whom I know you've interviewed, to try and bring awareness to male gender issues and to start creating a balance in the way we talk about gender. Yeah.
I mean, you and John are kind of considered the founding fathers of male psychology and male mental health, if you like. Why is it important to have a separate male branch of this?
I think because as scientists, we need to understand difference. I mean, science is about, even physical science is about two main things, correlation or difference. You have to work out how things correlate or how they differ. Now, the important thing about gender is it is very much about difference, and also there's a lot in common, but there are differences, and obviously there's been a very strong focus on female gender issues, quite rightly, and people like myself who promote men's issues are in no way against promoting women's issues. It's just that you get perceived that way because of the very biases we're trying to put across. And I spent most of my life working with women because more of them come into the NHS where I used to work, and the charity sector as well. But yeah, the importance of studying male gender is that it is part of the human race. It's half of it. And there are biological differences, psychological differences, and even if you're looking at it as in social terms, we need to understand social psychology of gender. So it's important to actually focus inclusively on all the different demographics within the human condition. And men are one of them. In fact, they're half. But because they're half of humanity and yet haven't been studied, I mean, you go into any bookshop in the high street and look for male gender books. If you look in gender studies books in Waterstones or any other available bookshop, you just won't find stuff on men. So that in itself kind of echoes this idea that it's invisible. I think to look at it from the other side, there was an assumption that men had equality, they had no issues, so women needed to somehow catch up. I think that was the basis of early feminism. And quite rightly, in many ways, women needed to catch up in certain areas. But then it's sort of become the idea that there are no issues for men, or that there never were any issues for men. I mean, just looking at the military draft, for example, I mean, men have always been called upon to defend society in times of war, and we're just now commemorating 80 years since D-Day. But the coverage won't really focus on masculinity or men, even though 99.9% of the people who died on the front line were men. It isn't a gender issue, you know, the way we think about gender. So the importance of studying male psychology, therefore, is partly about studying bias, because John and I were well aware of other types of bias in psychology, in social psychology, because John has more of a background in social psychology. I'm more clinical. But bias in gender, there wasn't a theory of male gender bias. The bias was so big, there wasn't even a theory of the bias. So this is what our quest has been now for over 10 years now.
So we're told we live in a man's world, and the patriarchy is kind of weighing down on us, and we need to keep giving more benefits to women to kind of even things up. I mean, what would you say to that?
I'd say that's a myth. It's a very popular myth, though, and it's achieved the status of a fact without ever being tested. Nobody ever tested patriarchy as a theory and compared groups or studied various things. But just one obvious point to make on that is if you look at voting rights, people often talk about women's suffrage. Women didn't have the vote and didn't start getting the vote till 1918, but no one ever publicises the fact that men, half of the men, didn't have the vote either. In 1918, half, the rest of all men got the vote by 1918.
It was the richer people, wasn't it, who had the vote?
Yes, I think people who had the vote were property owners. So if you like, working class men didn't have the vote till 1918 either. But you look back to 1918, what was that date? That was the First World War. So 1914 to 1918, we had thousands of young men dying, working class men who didn't have the vote. But that's never ever the story. There's no great sort of film about it, or men, no one's sort of proud of men. No one's kind of saying, men, they're great, they do all this sacrifice for us. Even now we've got the 80th anniversary of D-Day. No one's making it a gender issue. When a man does something bad, it becomes a gender issue. So that's the idea of our gamma bias theory, which I'm sure I can come on to later. But the idea, John and I wanted to come up with a conceptual framework that sort of formalised how the biases are operating, not simply say, oh, people are anti-male and sort of moan about it, but actually come up with a scientific theory of what's going on. So that was our main quest, was to try, if you can't identify a bias, you can never challenge it, if you can't articulate it. So I'm glad for the opportunity today, obviously, to talk to you about it.
And before we go into that theory, I just wanted to ask you what you think about this idea that we have a crisis of masculinity in the West.
I think that, again, is part of the mythology. I think there are some problems for men in the West, because obviously there are various changes in society, the type of work that's being done. But if you look at working class men, they're still doing all the same jobs. Everything's being built pretty much by men. Everything's being maintained by men. Everything's being defended by men. The working class men that always built and maintained and protected us are still doing that. So the crisis is not in the function or the value of men to society. The crisis is in our respect for it, because in the old days there was a balance, obviously, that we needed to help women catch up in certain areas, but there was a kind of respect for what men were doing. There was an honour in being male, because people were respected for their contribution to society. But what's happened is that I think because the biases we're talking about are more middle class driven or more sort of elite driven, we've actually forgotten working class completely. The working class man has really, in every country, not just the West, really, has been slave labour in some ways. You know, a lot of men died building all the bridges and the tunnels and all of doing the mining, the deep sea fishing, going up buildings, everything you can name, road building. Men have died doing that. So, in a sense, the crisis is in our loss of respect for men. It's not the men that are the problem. Just as with feminism needed respect for women's capacity to be if a woman wants to be a doctor, why shouldn't she be? So there was no respect for women as having an intellect and having a contribution to make. So the crisis now is not in men, it's in our attitudes to men. So we're basically saying a man is toxic these days and ignoring all the good things men are doing all around us. The vast majority of men are really good, but we're ignoring that and focusing on a tiny minority of men who do bad things. Of course there's a tiny minority of all demographics who do bad things.
Do you think somehow we can't read the language of men? We can't quite understand masculinity in the same way we could femininity?
I think that's right. I mean, just simply take a simple example. I worked with the Samaritans as a teacher consultant to the London Samaritans for over 10 years. And 75% of suicides are men, but the Samaritans didn't have a particular training model for how to talk to men. It just assumed people ring up and men have to talk in the same way women. So, and of course that we still expect that, you know, all the charities these days saying, come on guys, talk, open up. So we take a sort of female model of communication as our sort of gold standard of what men should be doing. But myself and a colleague, Michael Walton, we came up with a model called Man Talk, and we trained the Samaritans volunteers in London for over a year. What we did was we exposed them to the man's world. We didn't sit down and say, this is how you talk to men. We simply got a blues musician in, and it got him to do a tutorial on what's blues music about. What are men doing when they play blues music? We got in the Royal Shakespeare Company, and they did a little bit of Julius Caesar for us. The women played the men's parts, and we asked the women, what does it feel like, the pressures of being in those male characters? We had various artists and other people come in for the volunteers, and then we talked about male communication and female communication. So we did that for a year. We didn't say this is how you should listen to men or anything or talk to them. But what we did at the beginning of the intervention, we measured the length of time men who called the Samaritans were speaking for. And we measured the number of calls that were under 5 minutes. And then at the end of the year, we measured the length of calls with men again. And we found that by the end of that year, we'd at least doubled the length of time men were speaking to volunteers. We hadn't changed the men. They were calling in the same as usual. What we changed was the volunteers. So what John and I are saying is when we listen to men differently, we will hear them. But society is still pressurising men to talk differently, or to talk in a way it's called feminised. We did a special issue of the British psychological magazine, The Psychologist, in 2014, which was dedicated to men's issues, which was a bit of a breakthrough. It's the first time that magazine had covered men's issues. And there was one article by Linda Morrison from Surrey University and colleagues simply looking at the feminisation of the culture of the therapy space. We're expecting people to come into a room, look straight face to face into a therapist's eyes, talk about their feelings, and go out and regard that as a treatment for mental health problems. Now that isn't such a natural thing to do for men as it is for women. Right. Women are much more comfortable sitting in a chair, eyeballing you and talking about how they feel. But that's the model we use for all therapy, as if it's universal. So we haven't made any gender nuances to that at all. But if you look now at modern charity, and as I've just said, the Samaritans, once they changed their way of listening, Samaritans is one place where you get 50-50, you know, as many men called as women. And that's because it's anonymous, partly, because then men are more comfortable to talk. But then when you add a new way of listening, men will talk more. The NHS is still not really doing enough to have male-friendly models. And this is another thing John and I and other colleagues around the country are trying to pioneer, is new ways of working with men. You don't even have to sit and talk half the time, because mental health is about being cared about, being listened to in different ways, and belonging to, you know, so if you start a football club or a boxing club, take young boys, listen to them, help them develop skills, take care of them, support them, help them belong, their mental health is going to go way up. But if you sit them in the room and say to them, okay, what did you dream about last night? Or what was your relationship like with your mother? They'll run a mile. And I'm a clinician. I trained in family therapy, CBT. I trained in psychodynamic therapy and broader counselling techniques. I know all those techniques, but I wouldn't apply them in a sort of universal way to people. I would take account that everyone, I mean, I've had some women clients who aren't comfortable doing one-to-one talking. Sometimes with clients, I will go for a walk with them. You just talk. Men actually are more comfortable talking shoulder to shoulder. If you drive in a car with a guy, you'll get a much better conversation than if you sort of expect them to sort of just stare at you and talk. So men like to be doing something while they talk. I think that's why the golf course is so popular. Men love to do something while they're talking, there to be in action. But society is so, we call men emotionally illiterate in the society, which is very discriminatory. It's actually society that's illiterate towards male communication. So our quest is to keep pushing away at changing the way we work with men.
I wanted to get into your theory on gamma bias. This is what you're known for. I was hoping you could give us a layman's introduction to that and tell us how it manifests in our lives.
Well, gamma bias is a theory that sort of evolved. It had one light bulb moment, but it was mainly an evolution. It started with William Collins, who I know you've spoken to on this programme before, and he had this brilliant idea of the empathy gap. And he's an absolutely amazing guy with statistics, so all the statistics are there. And he's very kindly, for all of us, created a little Bible of data that we can all look to. So he created this whole concept around, you know, the empathy gap, which is that we're less sympathetic, really, or caring about men in the same position as women. We're more sympathetic to women and children, and he started there. Gamma bias just expanded that, really. So it very much includes the empathy gap, which is one quadrant of our thing. So gamma bias is 4 areas of bias. The first is victimhood, which is the empathy gap. When a man is a victim, we don't have as much compassion as for a woman or a child, but then children, you would expect that. So the other 3 boxes are perpetration. When a man is a perpetrator, we magnify that as a gender issue. So if a man does something bad, it's a gender issue. It's about masculinity. Then the other box is when men do good things, or people do good things, do we celebrate them? Once we do good things, we don't celebrate the good things men do as a gender issue. So, for example, all the soldiers who gave their lives that we only yesterday were commemorating their sacrifice, they were all men. There was about 0.1% of women, you know, and I'm not decrying the role of women in the war. They were fantastic, but the actual frontline fighting bit was done by nearly all men. But no one mentions gender. Yeah. So that's gamma bias, because here's an opportunity to be positive about masculinity, to say, thanks guys, you've saved the free world. You've gone, young men of 18, probably younger, because some of them lied about their age, got into the army, went on a boat, got onto a beach, got shot at, killed, maybe survived, got injured. Some of them came back, and they've got all these memories. They did that because they were protecting the free world from the Nazis. At that point, that was a dangerous time in world history. So now we're celebrating their achievement, if you like, or commemorating, and also, mourning the loss. But we're not making it a gender issue. So what gamma bias says is that when men do good things, that you can't do anything better than sacrificing your life for society. Even that is not a gender issue when men do it. So that's celebration. The other box is privilege. So when a man gets a privilege, it becomes a gender issue. So compared to a woman. So like all the privileges around motherhood and time off and time to be with kids and all of that is seen as a sort of a right. But anything that men might have accrued in the past through their role in society that might be considered a privilege is seen as a privilege. So, but the point of gamma bias is that you can do good things, do bad things. You can receive good things or receive bad things. When men receive bad things or do good things, no one makes it a gender issue. When men do bad things or receive good things, gender's the story. So that's a massive bias. We are currently testing that bias in international research with colleagues in USA and in Europe. So we want to come up with some data to add to the list of data, but it's pretty obvious from everyday life. For example, we just talked about soldiers, the D-Day landings. They said, all the people celebrating said, we thank the men and women. They included women in that, even though it was a tiny percent on the front line. And there were some, no doubt, very brave women, of course, resistance fighters, all kinds of brilliant women. But we're talking about percentages. The percentage was very small, but they're included. But when we come to, say, sex offending, there's quite a number of female sex offenders. But we don't talk about women sex offenders at all, even though there are way more women sex offenders than there are women soldiers. So when we have soldiers to celebrate, we say men and women. When we have rapists or sex offenders to chastise, we just say men. So we've basically highlighted women, we've given a positive image of women in an area where it's nearly all men doing it. And we've excluded a negative image of women in an area where it's a lot of women doing it, but it's a big minority, but it's still a substantial number.
One that comes to mind for me would be firefighters as well.
Yeah, we call them firefighters now. I think it's about 3% are women. And again, with firefighting, if your house is burning down, you need someone to do the job. Obviously, women are less. There are some women who are brilliant at that. Same with the army. Now, there are some women who meet the standard, but you've got to have a standard of safety. So, yeah, we call them firefighters now, even though it's 3% women or whatever. It might be 5 by now. And, I'm very much an equal opportunities person. So, obviously, if any woman wants to be a firefighter and can do it, that's brilliant. But we need to recognise as a society that most firefighters are still men. And is that a gender issue? Of course it is. If you're going to say that most sexual assaults are by men, that's a gender issue. Then statistics matter for everything. So most firefighters are men, but there's no praise now or respect for masculinity because we're only focusing on the bad stuff. And of course the numbers of men who are assaulting or dangerous or abusive is probably less than 0.5%. Whereas all the men who are doing good things, I always look at it like this. John Barry and myself are going to work on a new concept. Our next concept away from gamma bias, building on it, is the idea of the harm and help index. Because we talk about, I've been in countless debates. I had to talk at the Cambridge Union, talked at UCL, talked to even the BBC on the theme of toxic masculinity. And this idea that men are toxic seems to come from the idea of men are destructive towards women, they're damaging. So John Barry and myself are looking now at a new measure, a scientific measure of the help and harm given by men. So the way we would do that is multiply the numbers of men who harm women and children, if you like, multiply the amount of harm by the numbers of men doing it, and then compare that with the amount of good men are doing to protect women and children, and then compare those two ratios. And if you have a harm-help ratio, it'll be like 99% help. But gamma bias means that we focus on the 1% of harm. Just think of life-saving that men do in war and peacetime for women and children. That's never seen as a gender issue. But if a man kills a woman, which does happen occasionally, it's rare, but it gets a lot of publicity, so it's made to seem as if it's the norm, it's highlighted as a gender issue. So we're basically making men look awful when they're not. Most men are decent. Most men are fathers, they're workers, they're contributors, they build things, they protect. And a few men, and the men who are abusive, are damaged. They're not ordinary men. If you look at forensic psychology, then a colleague of mine, Naomi Murphy, did a study in 2018, or reported on it, where she looked at men who were sex offenders in high secure prisons. Over half of them have been abused by their mothers or female caregivers. That's not to blame women, because that's a minority of women. Most women are fantastic. But the men who are misogynistic or damaging towards women, or, you know, in that way very dangerous to women, have themselves been abused. Not to excuse them, they need to be locked up and helped to change if they can. If not, then they shouldn't be let out. But the point is, they're only harmful to women because they've been damaged quite often by women, and obviously by men as well. The point is that your typical man has an instinct to protect women. And this is the other thing that we talk about in our theories, is archetypes, because there's so much talk in gender theory about stereotypes, but it's actually more about archetypes, and that goes back to evolution. So we can maybe consider that issue as well in terms of male and female behaviour. So again, trying to look at how we explain William Collins's data, and he talked about evolution, and he's right. There's two things, and I think he's right about, there's two main causes of the bias. One is, in evolutionary terms, we've evolved to protect women and children. Even the Geneva Convention spells that out. You must protect women and children. It doesn't mention men. Men are assumed to be the protectors. So you can argue that's patriarchal in that it's a man's world, so women and children are othered and we protect them. But equally, if we're talking about a world of equal rights, if you really believe in equality, you have to say we've got to stop talking like that. We'd have to protect men and women equally. Now, my opinion is that we're going to go on protecting women and children because that's the evolutionary and a common sense thing to do for all kinds of physical, biological and social reasons. But what we need to do is restore the respect for men for doing that. But the Geneva Convention talks about protecting women and children, and policies in this country on violence are called violence against women and children policies. Male victims don't even get included because they're not categorised as women, or they're either categorised as women and children, or they're in subsection of the policy. So we don't believe that men can be victims. We're set up, we're wired by evolution to protect women and children. So that's why the bias is there. It's not simply a social bias, it's kind of an instinctive bias. And archetypes, we've done some work on archetypes, which is, these are not stereotypes, these are instinctive behaviours which are more on average going to, like a male archetype means that a man on average is going to have a different instinct in certain forms of behaviour to a woman. So like a man's more likely to take a risk, more likely to jump in and save you from a burning building, is more likely to risk his life in a dangerous situation. So these are the male archetypes. So that men, on average, I mean, just look at boys playing. Even when they're very, very young, there are differences in the way boys and girls play. And boys tend to play fighting games where they're taking risks and jumping off things. So these are gender differences. They're not socialised entirely because people aren't spending hours teaching boys to do that. And all the games, the war games and everything kids play, they're very different. But these are average differences. Some girls like to play with guns, and great, they should do. I mean, play with whatever you like. As I said before, everyone should be equal. But there are archetypes, which means that men and women are on average different. It's just like men are on average taller than women. It's no good someone saying to us, oh look, I saw a tall woman, so your theory is rubbish. Because the average height of a man is much more than the average height of a woman. So the average instinct of a man is different from the average instinct of a woman. Women's instincts are more drive towards emotional connection with kids and nurturing kids. Doesn't mean to say they have to do that, they shouldn't be, but that's just the archetype. You can see that in baby girls. They follow, infant observation studies, girls are more drawn to stimuli, even babies, female babies are more on average drawn to social stimuli, smiling faces, where the baby boys are more drawn to moving objects and sort of things that are doing stuff. So there's a gender difference from birth. There are instincts. It doesn't mean to say you have to, if you're a woman that doesn't want to play with dolls and you want to be a soldier, great. But the average, on average, there will be a difference, and society has made the mistake of thinking they're stereotypes. And therefore now, if a boy wants to do something masculine, it's almost been reversed. A man is now criticised for following his instincts. Yeah. And a girl is too. If a girl just wants to be a mother these days, I suspect she's probably humiliated a bit. You know, God, you just want to be a mother? Mothering is probably the most important thing you can do.
You don't want to be a CEO.
No, well, you could be both, but at the end of the day, being a mother, there's nothing more important, I don't think, than being a mother. Because if you know about mental health as I do, those early attachments to your mothers are crucial in your sense of who you are.
What can we do to try and restore this respect and deal with this bias? How can we move on from it?
I think it's a number of things. One is obviously calling it out and providing the evidence, because these days, you look on Twitter or something, or X as it's now called, everyone's just debating sort of emotionally, and it's important to have data. So to do research to show these things, obviously when you say it, like firefighters is a gender neutral term, but most of them are men. We wouldn't have, if it's a bad thing, we don't use gender neutral language when men do it. So we've got to just get more data, research showing that. That's why we're doing gamma bias research. Another thing is working with the politicians who are listened. So I, myself, John, other people have had meetings privately with politicians. Sometimes these things are a bit hard to talk about in public. And politicians don't even want to be seen to be, because it can seem, when you start talking about men and boys issues, people perceive you as some kind of negative person. So it's very hard for politicians to get on the bandwagon of the science behind this. But we do have private conversations with some politicians. We're writing about it. We're trying to influence public attitudes. Doing this talk with you, that's why I took up your kind invite, because it's just another opportunity to influence a few more people, because people will watch this and hopefully it'll click with some people that there is an issue there. So also we have to influence those who provide help. Like there are charities out there that are very good with men and boys, and they do really fantastic stuff. And we just need to publicise and develop those kind of things more. For example, domestic violence. I think it's beginning to become a bit clearer to people now that there are substantial numbers of male victims of domestic violence. Some people argue it's sort of 50-50, but even if it's not 50-50, it's at least 30 to 40% of victims of domestic violence are men, and yet there's no services out there. So we have to influence the culture of the charity sector, and that's hard, because there's a whole industry out there that's predicated on the notion that domestic violence is men on women, when actually in gay relationships it's women on women, men on men. It's women on men are violent to men and men to women. You can argue statistically there is more in certain groups of violence, but domestic violence on the whole is, there's so many male victims that you can't say that's a gender issue, and yet it remains a gender issue in all our policies. And yet firefighters, where you've got 95% of men, is gender neutral. So it's really, the bias is in our politicians, it's in our wiring a little bit, and it's in our social conditioning. It's a post-feminist thing, because feminism had a very valuable role to play in the West. It's probably more needed now in the East, if you know. But in the West, it did need to address certain issues. But these days, we've gone we've still remained in the belief, in the mindset, that women are catching up in some way. But actually, if you look at education, it's 60-40 now, women in universities. It's a massive gap in education. There are still big areas like life expectancy has always been years more for women than men. These are massive issues, but they're not addressed. So how do we address it? I'm doing it at my level. There are international movements. We talk to people in Australia, in America, who are similarly motivated. There are movements within America to try and change the politics a bit there, although some of that can be a little bit negative too. For example, people talking about this crisis of masculinity. It tends to evoke pity rather than respect. There isn't really a crisis of masculinity. There's a crisis of attitudes to masculinity. And in fact, if you go into schools now, boys are being exposed to all of this negativity about their identity, which, if you know anything about education, it's just disastrous to go in with a negative message to children about who they are, especially in an age when we're all meant to be proud of our identities. So another thing I'm doing, I'm working with school motivators who've got a much more balanced view of helping boys and girls to believe in themselves equally. And they're doing schoolwork. We'll report on that when we get some data. So I think a key thing is school influencers, because another problem that arises is because boys are starved of any positive messaging now. They do go underground to people like Andrew Tate. So it just reinforces the prejudice. Instead of people thinking, well, why are these boys desperate to find a positive message? Because they're not getting one in mainstream life. So if we went into schools with positive messages for boys, instead of telling them they've got to not become... I mean, we're assuming boys are default abusers, when that's 0.5%. And all the boys that will become abusers have been abused themselves. So they're not abusive because they're boys. They're abusive because they're damaged, and then their masculinity might shape the character of the behaviour that they exhibit when they're needing to take those feelings out on somebody. And as we said, you know, some boys are abused by female adults, and therefore they have this thing about women, and they are dangerous, so they do need to be locked up. But they're a tiny minority. But we're going into schools as if those were the typical men. And this really is a toxicity. And so we haven't got toxic masculinity. What we've got is toxic attitudes to masculinity. And they are rife in the media and in politics. And so we've got to, you know, it's a long process. I mean, quite clearly what I would like to do is set up a centre for male psychology in this country when we get the funding, which there are ways we might get it. And then we can do conferences, media, we can do teaching, we can train psychologists, we can do more work with politicians to work on policy improvements. But basically, it makes sense. If you want a healthy society, you've got to respect everyone in it and be inclusive. And that's all the language these days, inclusivity, diversity, except for boys. Yeah. And that's crazy. So we can include everybody except boys. And even then it becomes like intersectional. So a boy who's black or gay gets a little bit of love from society, but a white boy gets nothing because a white boy doesn't tick any box. And yet we're talking about inclusivity. And the educational performance of white boys, white working class boys, is very low. And we have no sympathy because we have this image that the white male is somehow an oppressive creature, when really a white male is a protector, as are all men. And men's instincts are to protect. But somehow, instead of protective masculinity, thank you very much, guys, for saving the free world in 1944, it's toxic masculinity. We'll be celebrating D-Day yesterday and today. Tomorrow there'll be something else on toxic masculinity, as if all those guys who died were somehow toxic instead of heroic. So yeah, there are some bad guys, but let's generalize. As a scientist, you should generalize from the majority, not the minority sample. Any basic statistician will tell you, you generalize from the majority, not the minority of the sample. So gamma bias is we're generalizing from the minority of bad men. So that it's so awful that when a man does something bad to a woman, which of course does happen, we see that as a class act by all men against all women. Which means that that's the next level of gamma bias that we're going to be describing. That a bad action by a man is seen as a class action by all men. A good action by a man is not seen as a class action by all men. And a class action against a woman is seen as a class action against all women. Because we've evolved to protect women, anything bad to a woman is a class action. So once a man does something bad to a woman, it's a double class action. It's a class action by all men against all women. And that's what you see in the media. So gamma bias is a very neat theory for describing it. But because of gamma bias theory isn't going to be too popular. So we come up against a lot, oh, you know, you're basically just a men's rights activist, whatever that is. I'm a scientist and a humanitarian and a therapist. I mainly help women. But, you know, and even if you were a men's rights activist, is that so wrong? A feminist is a female rights activist. So you know, that's the level of bias, that a man's rights activist is thought of as a bad person just because they're interested in the rights of men.
If we look at smoking, there was a period of time where people started to realise it was bad, but it was about 30 years before we got to the point where it became widely accepted and things properly changed.
Yes.
Do you think we're kind of in that period now where people are starting to realise? I mean, we saw the Danny Dyer TV programme, yes. There's the all-party parliamentary group for men and boys. Yes. Are things turning?
I think that's the hope. We always want to know where we are on the turn. It's like a big oil tanker that takes a long time to turn. And the optimistic view is that the turning is happening. Because yes, the Danny Dyer programme, which I was in briefly, highlighted Sunderland University, which is the first male psychology module in the world. So that in itself, because when I did the lecture at Sunderland that they filmed a bit of, I was saying Sunderland University is the first university to have a male psychology module. There's your bias, you know. But so yes, the boat is turning in that mainstream media are less likely to turn it away now. They're a bit more likely, because that was Channel 4 who put that out, so that's credit to them for doing that. And Channel 5 did something on a male victim of domestic violence, which is quite, he was being falsely accused of being the perpetrator when he was the victim. These things are turning, I think. I think you're right, it's like as a generation or two. So I think we started, I think we look at it generationally. I think that we're probably 10 or 15, maybe, yeah, I'd say we're 10 or 15 years into something that needs about 20 years. But I would say in another 5 years it will be better. Thanks to people like yourself for raising it. And because, yes, at the end of the day, most people are decent. They believe in equality, equity, humanity, fairness, balance, you know. And no one wants to protect men who are toxic. No one wants to protect men who are privileged. But equally, there's so many more men who are protective, helping the world, and who are also victims of things, but don't get, if they report it, don't get believed, or if don't even bother to report it, they just take it on the chin. Men out there who are making the world go round, and the working class man still makes the whole world go round. So that massive image of men as being toxic is a fashion that sort of started probably since second wave feminism onwards. So I think we're now into I think it's turning now, but whether we're now on the downhill of the turn, or we're still on the brow of the hill, I'm not sure. But I do think, I'm not a sort of pessimist. I don't think we're all chipping away at nothing. And I do think that all the best things in life take time to evolve and develop. And I think when we end up with a post-feminist world that accepts men's issues too, we'll end up with a much healthier society, because men and women will be more fairly treated in the law courts, for example, as parents when they separate. Dads will get more of a role in society, because all of the mental health problems we see in the world, so many of them relate to not having a dad in your life. And yet if masculinity was toxic, we should be trying to get rid of dads. So it's all of this stuff. So I really think we are turning, and I think every time we talk about this sort of thing in a media situation, we talk about it in a fair and balanced way like this, it helps. So I thank you very much for asking me to talk about this.
Martin Seager, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.